Okay, good.
Pastor, the overhead lights are still off.
Oh,
The switch is right behind Pastor
Okay.
Jeff.
I'm going to let him take care of that. I'm going to have you click to the first slide, because that's the intro slide, and you all kind of know where we're going, don't you? I did a little something here. Didn't work perfectly. I decided to say we're kind of opening the book on the Feast of Tabernacles tonight, and so I tried to get a little visual there. I'm still learning. You know, a good follower of Jesus is a good student. That's what the word disciple kind of ties into. And so I'm still a student. We're going to go back to Leviticus 23, so I'll get you in the right place. And you can go ahead and click. And I think that should take us to... You can go ahead and click again. There we go. That's what I wanted. The take-home truth. Because there's always a take-home truth, right? God dwells in His fullness with those who obey. So we're going to be talking about that this evening in terms of the Feast of Tabernacles. You can go ahead and click. There we go. You've already seen that enough, but that is the whole outline. It's really neat to me that God gives the outline for the Bible in the Bible. See, what we got to do is find out what the outline is in a section of Scripture, but God's thoughts are ordered and they're structured. Really, what we're learning to do is we're learning to understand and think God's thoughts after Him. And that's really what it's all about. It's really kind of fitting. I'm seeing the sun shine in the windows here. We're really getting ready for tomorrow, because remember how the Jewish calendar works with sunset? So this is really our last evening together, and it's kind of fitting because it's our last evening together, and really by the time we finish tonight, I'll already be in tomorrow getting ready to fly out tomorrow, because that's sort of the way it works. This is the last of the feasts. They're all in the 7th month. We've got the first day, the 10th day, and then we have this feast, the 15th day. Now remember, in a lunar cycle, that's about halfway through the month. So the Feast of Tabernacles will always end up being on a full moon. Because in that lunar cycle, you go from new moon to full moon back through the cycle again. And you have all those in-between stages. So a new month is a new moon, and the 15th day of the month will be a full moon. Just a little side note, people kept asking me about the blood moons, because there were several blood moons. And I say, well, you know what, it's not surprising to me that you would have a lunar eclipse with a full moon on a Jewish holiday, because how many lunar eclipses have you ever seen when the moon was a new moon? It doesn't astronomically happen. To have a lunar eclipse, you have to have the sun interposing itself with the moon in such a way that the moon would be full, and then the sun blocks that, and the shadow of the earth actually hits the sun, actually blocks the sunlight. The earth gets in between, so it'd be a full moon, and you'd have the sun hitting, and then the earth blocks that, and the moon gets less light, and it gives it its reddish tint. And so I don't know whether that's a sign of anything. I do know this: it's not so spectacular. Astronomically, it makes sense to me that if there's going to be a lunar eclipse, it would be during a full moon. And since a lot of the Jewish holidays are on full moons, the chance of a Jewish holiday being on a full moon is really very good. Are we getting closer to the end? Yeah, you know, Paul said, your redemption is closer than when you first believed. And Peter, actually Hebrews says, in these last days or in these last times, he speaks to us through his Son. And Peter, when he gave his sermon, talked about the last times. So we're probably in the last of the last times, but really the last times began when the church was formed. And so, in a real sense, it's just a question of where we are in the last times. But I'm not busy staring at the conjunction of planets and doing all sorts of astronomy and astrology to figure out if the end is near. Do I think there are signs? You have a dear brother named Mike Wingfield, and he points out there are signs. But I want to be careful of seeing signs where God isn't giving me a sign. There's enough to tell me that things are getting organized and things are getting ready for the next great prophetic events without necessarily having to do star charts. So, am I again it? Can I say it isn't so? No. But do I spend a lot of time saying it is so? No, I don't. Because we should go from what we know to what we don't know. That's sound reasoning. But going from what you're not sure of to what you don't know doesn't get you very far. And so that's the calendar. And this holiday would actually fall on a full moon, the 14th or 15th day of the month. And so we can go click, okay? And we're going to be in, Leviticus 23. We're going to look all the way through here. And then I'm going to focus on the rabbinical way things are done. What did Jewish people carry over from Bible times into rabbinical Judaism? Okay? Because Judaism today is not the same as the Judaism in the Bible, but a lot of stuff was carried over. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, on the 15th day of the 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days to the Lord. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation, and you shall do no customary work. For 7 days you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord, and on the 8th day you shall have a holy convocation and an offering made by fire to the Lord. It is a sacred assembly, and you shall do no customary work on it. These are the feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, to offer a burnt offering made by fire, a burnt offering, a grain offering, a sacrifice, and drink offerings, and everything in its day, besides the Sabbaths of the Lord, besides the gifts, besides all the vows, besides your free will offerings, which you give to the Lord. And on the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered the fruit of the land, you shall keep the feast of the Lord for 7 days. The first day there shall be a Sabbath rest, and on the 8th day there shall be a Sabbath rest. And you shall take for yourself on the first day the fruit of beautiful trees, the branches of palm trees, the boughs of leafy trees, and the willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord for 7 days, and you shall keep it as a feast of the Lord for 7 days in the year. And it shall be a statute forever in your generations, and you shall celebrate it in the 7th month, and you shall dwell in booths for 7 days. All who are native Israelites shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know I made the children of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." And so Moses declared to the children of Israel the feasts of the Lord. This ends the cycle of the feasts of the Lord. And so there are several things there that ended up being commanded. Now you see a lot of sacrificial language, right? That did not get carried over. There is no way for Jewish people to do that. There is no temple. God said he would find a place for his name, and so eventually you have a temple there. You have a tabernacle which is portable as the children of Israel are traveling around until they find rest from their enemies, and the place where the Lord will put his name is established. You know that takes all the way to King David? What's with the big delay? A whole lot of disobedience happened. And so you go from Samuel, and eventually God has his man put in his place. The children of Israel enjoy a golden age under David and under Solomon. And really under Solomon it all starts to decline. And so there is a place where God puts his name, and they do indeed experience that rest. But it takes generations after Joshua to go ahead and get there. And so the children of Israel don't do sacrifices anymore. Okay, there are some things that Hasidic Jews do to kind of emulate that and remind them of that. Some parts of Judaism do the thing with a chicken and swinging a chicken, and you can forget it. It's not the temple. Okay? To put it in very Yiddish type, Jewish type terms, swinging a chicken is not the same as the temple. Okay? And they tried to remember and they tried to keep alive, but the thing is, in 70 AD, everything changed. And you had the starting of something called the parting of the ways and a whole bunch of stuff. What can the children of Israel still do? Well, they can still build a booth. The children of Israel had temporary shelters, and they had to remember the Lord and him being with them through that whole process. And so to this day, it's actually one of the feasts my family observed the least. We don't come from a family of carpenters. My dad was an accountant, And I've been told that if anyone could bend a nail with a hammer, I am like perfect for it. And so it's not something I grew up as much with as people who were more orthodox or more conservative. But I did go with my grandfather when I was young, and I think I did actually, the synagogue had a sukkah, and they had a temporary booth. Jewish people will take a meal in them. Even if you can't sleep in the sukkah, you take a meal, you recite the appropriate blessings. Some will actually sleep in the sukkah. And if you go to New York City, which is extremely crowded, you will see sidewalk sukkahs in the Orthodox neighborhood. And synagogues will have sukkah, and you will see these temporary things being built. They now, for people like me, have come up with prefab sukkahs for the constructionally challenged. And you can go ahead and buy a prefab and put it together real easy, and you don't even have to know much about construction. But that's something that Jewish people will do because they were told that they were to dwell in booths for the time period. There was to be a special celebration on the first day and the 8th day. Okay? They will also do something called the etrog and the lulav. Now remember, they were to take several types of trees. They were to take beautiful trees, the branches of palm trees, the boughs of leafy trees, and the willows of the brook. Now we know what the willows of the brook are, right? We can probably guess what palm trees are. If you've been to Arizona, palm trees are not a big problem. You see them all the time. You have also 2 other types of trees that are used. And they're called the 4 species. And they'll be bound together in what's called a lulav. So all these branches will fit in a common base. And they will literally be waved in all 4 directions, representing God's basic sovereignty and kingship over the whole earth. There is a lot of symbolism in tabernacles that you're going to see relates to the future kingdom. The idea that God will rule over the nations. And then there's a fruit called a etrog. An etrog is from a citrus type of family. I mean, it looks kind of like a lemon, and it's actually waved with the lulav. And those things have been preserved. The sukkah, the 4 species, and the etrog. And I think all 4 species grow in Arizona, but I'm not running around the desert looking for them. And so that is still done to this day. This is a happy festival. Remember, Yom Kippur was very solemn. This is very celebratory. Go ahead and go click. Now I want to focus on what all this means. I don't want to well-verse you in the rabbis, but the interesting thing is that the rabbis said that basically the sacrifices during the Feast of Tabernacles were not only for Israel, they were for the nations of the world. And so there was this sort of focus on the nations of the world. And so you're going to see that there's a lot of kingdom language, and I think it's because of the verses we're going to be looking at and other things. But the idea that Israel acted as a priestly nation for the nations of the world before they came to know God in order to temporarily avert God's wrath was in the rabbinical writings. It's kind of there, the idea that Israel served the purpose of reflecting God, and also they were in a position to talk to God about the nations. Okay, they could have a role of being what God desired. The Abrahamic blessing was to go to all the nations, and they were supposed to have a part in not providing atonement so much as paganism is offensive to God, and we want these nations to end up being represented. They can't be represented now because they don't know Him, but we can be representatives of Him to the world. I don't know. I do find it fascinating to take you through Jonah and ask what in the world did the Ninevites do that averted God's wrath? Because without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness of sin. Jesus hadn't come yet, so he couldn't have done cross work for them yet. What was going on? Well, there were still sacrifices going on in Israel. So I wonder sometimes, and I think there might be something to God temporarily having ways of doing things. Let's look at prophecy and see why this gets so connected to the kingdom. Now you can go click. We're going to spend some time in Zechariah. Now let me tell you what really excites me about this particular holiday. Now you may have a little trouble finding Zechariah, right? He's considered one of those minor prophets, but he isn't minor at all. We're going to spend a little time in Zechariah. Zechar means to remember. The ayah part is the Lord. Hebrew names are kind of interesting that way. The Lord remembers, or remembrance of the Lord. The idea behind Zechariah's name. Names mean a lot. I could take you through the first chapter of Ruth and show you how funny the book of Ruth is. There's like hidden humor in the book of Ruth because of what the names mean. God has a tremendous sense of humor. We're in 14, the day of the Lord. And if you go down past and you go down to 14, and really the verses before are describing the same thing. The nations are going to come up against Jerusalem. You think that's a possibility? If you don't read some recent UN resolutions, I guarantee you it's a possibility. I see no problem with the nations turning against Israel. I don't think that that's a long shot at all. And in 14, Judah also will fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the surrounding nations shall be gathered together, gold and silver, in great abundance. Such shall be the plague that on a horse and on a mule and on a camel and a donkey and all the cattle that shall be in their camps. So shall this plague be. And God's discussing his judgment of the nations that will not get into his program and will follow this false leader. And this false leader will lead rebellion against God. Where's he going to do? He's going to take the place that God made for his name. It has history to it, and actually Satan's sort of the ultimate historical revisionist. And he's going to try to rewrite it. What you need to see is what happens after all this judgment. Just end there. The kingdom starts, but what's connected with this kingdom? It shall come to pass that everyone left of those nations which came against Jerusalem. That's why the previous verses are there. You need to understand the flow. The nations come against, and afterwards it shall be those who are left of the nations that came against Jerusalem. So some parts of some of those nations are going to survive to some extent, shall go up year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And it shall be whoever out of the families of the earth will not come up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, on them shall be no rain. And if the family of Egypt shall not come up and enter in, they shall have no rain. And they shall receive the plague which the Lord strikes the nations who do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And this shall be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations, that those who do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. In that day holiness to the Lord shall be engraved on the bells of the horses, and the pots in the Lord's house shall be like the bowls before the altar. Yes, every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be holiness to the Lord of hosts. Everyone who sacrifices shall come and take them and cook in them, and in that day there shall no more be the Canaanite in the house of the Lord. I'm not saying anybody makes it through the tribulation and gets to enter the kingdom without Jesus. What I am saying is there will be some who do not take the mark of the beast during that time period. Well, if they're not Jewish, what are they? They're from the nations. Actually, the amazing thing about the tribulation period is it's a period of great judgment. It's also a period of great revival. If you turn to Revelation 7, it says there are a multitude of the nations being pictured coming out of the tribulation who do not end up taking. So there'll be remnants of the nations that refuse to get on board with Antichrist, even though the nations themselves do. And when the kingdom ends, there'll be some representation of the nations. I'm not going to get into all the prophecy here. What you need to understand is what holiday will be celebrated in the kingdom. The Feast of Tabernacles. This is a Jewish holiday that you're all personally going to be invited to. Let me prove that to you. I'm going to prove that to you going back to 1 Thess 4, 16 and 17. Do you see where I ended up putting the words in bold? When we go to be with Christ, how long are we separated from him? 1,000 years? Once the bride is with the bridegroom, she is not separated again. Well, if Jesus comes to rule the earth during the millennial kingdom, and we will be with him, and we will be present in that millennial kingdom. Now, there's a debate among scholars whether we commute to work or whether we permanently live on the earth with it. Okay? I don't know. I haven't quite made it a firm decision on that yet. I have no problem with commuting. I figure the Lord's transportation system is certainly going to be superior to anything we have. I have no problem with the fact that He so wants us near Him that, we don't even retire for the evening somewhere else. Okay? But there is some discussion about the New Jerusalem and its relationship to the earthly Jerusalem during the kingdom. And so whether we run messages back and forth or how that all works, that starts to sometimes you get beyond the word and you start getting into speculation. I'm not going to do that because we're talking about the fact that if the Feast of Tabernacles is going on and the nations are going and the Lord is here, we're going to be around. This is a terribly relevant feast. And so this is a relevant feast prophetically to all of us in this room. You can go click. So how do I make it practical? You have systematic theology. That's where you take a doctrine and you try to follow it all the way through the Bible. Okay? You have historical theology where you see the main ideas and how they go through the Bible. And we should probably get our systematic from our biblical. That would be a better way to go. Then you have practical theology. Practical theology is, how does what I understand about God impact my life? That's practical theology. So we're going to do some practical theology this evening. You can go click. Okay. We talked about this morning, right? The tabernacle was designed for a specific purpose. The tabernacle was designed so that God could sojourn or dwell among His people. That's why you had very special rules about moving it. That's why you had very special group of people that God set aside so they will minister, they will be in charge of this. All of that is because God literally dwelt there. And we saw that with Yom Kippur. The Feast of Tabernacles has to do with the fact that the children of Israel had to depend upon the Lord as they were in these temporary shelters moving around the desert. I wouldn't want to be in the Arizona desert in a tent without some way to make it through. They were in temporary shelters, and their only permanence lied with God dwelling in the midst of them. That was their permanence. That was their security. That was what they had to look to in this situation where they were roving around in the desert, by the way, not necessarily knowing where they were going for the next part of the trip. Because remember, they end up doing a 40-year stint roaming around. It's probably the longest way to get to any point in the world is the route they took as they went from generation to generation. And so God's presence and the tabernacle are connected. You can go click. Okay. We're going to talk about what ends up happening here. This is one of the saddest chapters in the Bible. Ezekiel. You need to understand the connection between the tabernacle and what happens in Ezekiel. So we're going to go to Ezekiel 10. Ezekiel is a hard book to understand. There are a lot of visions. Ezekiel's told to do things that you don't necessarily want to be told to do. In fact, literally, God tells him to do strange things because those strange things are illustrations of truth. Ezekiel, you're going to sleep on your side. You're going to demonstrate this about Israel's spiritual condition. Ezekiel, you're going to do this because of Israel's spirit. You're going to become a living example. And when the people come to you and they say, why are you doing this weird thing, Ezekiel? You're going to say, because thus saith the Lord, this is your spiritual condition. And so Ezekiel's told to do things that we wouldn't necessarily want to do. Okay? And what you're going to end up seeing here is that the glory of the Lord, the presence of God, is going to depart from Israel because of their sin. And so Ezekiel has a vision, and he ends up having this vision, and then you get to verse 4. And the glory of the Lord went up from the cherubim. That's between the cherubim in the Holy of Holies, The glory of the Lord went up from the cherubim and paused at the threshold of the temple. So the glory of the Lord is departing from his central dwelling location, and he comes out to the threshold of the temple, the very entrance, okay, the very threshold where the temple is, and he's moving away. He's withdrawing himself. Now, if you continue to read, that withdrawal continues in 18 and 19. Okay? The glory of the Lord departed from the threshold of the temple and stood over the cherubim, and the cherubim lifted their wings and mounted up, and they went out, and the wheels beside them. Now remember, Ezekiel's kind of getting this the best he could, and they stood at the door of the eastern gate of the Lord's house. And the glory of the Lord was above them. And now we move from the temple threshold to that eastern gate. God is withdrawing himself because of their sin. This is a sad chapter. And then that withdrawal even goes on a little bit further, and God ends up departing from that area too, and continues to move out. And so you end up seeing that whole section. And what you need to see here is that God, who tabernacled among his people, is withdrawn from his people because of their incredible sin. The Day of Atonement provision was not enough to deal with the spiritual state of unrepentant, recalcitrant Israel that had allowed themselves to get off path and get led in places and ways they should not get. And so this is truly tragic. And so when you're reading this, you're seeing the withdrawal of God from the temple. And he's moving away. And he's slowly taking his presence. And by the way, God does that in response to their decision. C.S. Lewis said, God is too much of a gentleman to remain where he is not wanted. People always ask about being close to God. Well, maybe the better question is not how close God is to you, how close are you to him? Click. Most of you already filled those out. And I just looked to see if there was anyone who hadn't, because that was the last chance to do that. Since it looks like everyone's taken care of that, I'm going to do a little bit of creativity here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the slip presentation. I do thank everybody who filled one of those out. The office knows I'm here. They can put a little pin in Granby, Colorado. They will have to start getting a very detailed map soon because of our missionaries. And so we will move past that. Let's start talking about application. Okay? God wants to dwell with his people. What did he do in the garden? He walked with Adam and Eve. You can almost think of the garden as being the original tabernacle of God where he tabernacled with men. Then sin entered. And that broke fellowship, didn't it? And ever since the fall, God has been trying, and I don't say trying like he can't do it, he has been working in his sovereign way to reestablish what he created man for and what he desires from man. I think it's the Westminster Confession of Faith that says, what is the chief end of man? To glorify God and enjoy him forever. And really, that's the whole thing there. And what you're seeing is this incredible process where God is pursuing mankind in love. What an incredible love story your Bible is. From the beginning, where God walked with man, to the end, where that is all back again, and God is dwelling with man, and man and God are dwelling together, and he shall be their God, and they shall be his people. And this language is there, and there's this, and that's biblical theology, where you just follow this theme all the way through. And now, what do we do with all that? Click. Okay. Do we have a tabernacle today? You have a tabernacle today that is better than any sukkah that I can build. Of course, that's not saying much for me, but you have a sukkah that's better than any prefab thing that can come up, or anything that an Orthodox person can build. Where is the sukkah of God today? The tabernacle of God. And this is where it really gets exciting. When you turn to John, you need to understand that John is writing in Koine Greek, but understand John knew a little bit about the front part of his Bible. And whatever he didn't know about the front part of the Bible, guess what? Messiah could teach him as the best teacher in the world. Right? I mean, they walked with Jesus. What did they talk about? Well, probably not the latest football scores. Right? They talked about the Word, they talked about Israel, they talked about life, they talked about those things, and those walks were long walks. You know, one of the things my dad used to do with me was take me for these long walks where we discuss current events and stuff. And boy, you get a lot of discussing in about 2 miles of walking. And we used to do that regularly. And my dad was a walker. He's almost in his 90s. By the grace of God and the fact that God has used him being mentally and physically active, and he would take 5 and 10-mile walks. And he used to love that. And so we used to go walking. And the whole thing about that was that God did leave us a tabernacle. And John's Greek is informed by what came before. So yeah, it's Koine Greek, but it's rich Koine Greek. It's rich with theological insights that were available to John. Now, John is probably writing about 90 AD. I know scholars give or take, and I wasn't there. But we can know roughly when the period of time this was written. This is a later writing thing. Understand the background of what this means. If you place John at about 90, and most of your liberal scholars don't like anything to be late. It really bugs them if any Bible is written late. Okay? It's probably written after. If it's written in 90, the temple's destroyed. Do you realize what that means? Well, probably to the nations around, and John is written to believers, by the way. I write these things to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, that you may know you have eternal life. Amen. It's written to believers. Believers played in 2 basic kinds, right? Believers from the nations and believers from Israel. That's basically the way it was. The temple is destroyed. Look at the language that John uses here. I love this language. And we'll be looking particularly right around 14, right? And I will actually go up to 6. There was a man sent from God, and his name was John. Oh, guess who's writing this? Right? He was not the light, but was sent to bear witness to that light. That was the true light which gives light to every man coming into the world. And he was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and I think John is referring to Israel there, and his own did not receive him. But as many as did receive him, or as many as received him, to them he gave the right, actually I think the Greek word is the authority, to become children of God to those who believe in his name, who are born not of blood, that would mean by natural descent, or by just simply will. I mean, this is my idea, right? Salvation isn't our idea, it's God's idea. Nor the will of man, nor the will of the flesh, but of God. God is the one who put this program in place. He is the one that seeks people. It's what grace does. It takes the initiative. Right? Then we go here. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Greek word is very much like the Hebrew word shechem.